It's interesting that you can apply several logical criteria for evaluating a causal hypothesis with only a modest knowledge of the facts that it's trying to explain. So, a hypothesis is a tentative explanation connecting a variety of particular facts. It may eventually become part of an accepted peer-reviewed scientific theory depending on the results it provides by using a scientific method. So, for example, there is evidence that there are significant differences between American men and women with regard to how they solve moral dilemmas. So, the more precisely you put this into a question, an issue to be answered through a hypothesis, the more precise the question is, the more fruitful the hypothesis can be, especially in regards to the issue of how it's going to direct research. So, if the question you're asking as a basis for your hypothesis is, why do men and women think so differently in terms of problem solving moral dilemmas? And instead of asking that general question, you ask, is there something different about male and female brains such that it might be the cause of different forms of reasoning? There is evidence that male and female differences with regard to the frontal lobe explain why adolescent males don't have their frontal lobe developed until they're 21. And then we can consider hypothesis which explains different behaviors because of the slower development of the part of the brain, the frontal lobe, that's responsible for making judgments. There's also evidence that male and female brains are different with respect to the bridge that connects the left and right sides of their brains. It could have an evolutionary explanation, given that in more primitive times, women took their babies out to the fields to do agricultural labor and had to do two different types of tasks, therefore being able to multitask in an earlier agricultural era. So the more precise the question is framed, the more fruitful the hypothesis. Let's ask about the possibility that it's our cultural norms that explain the differences in our moral problem solving. For example, if there is a set of social norms that mandate males have primary roles in the public sphere and females have primary responsibility in the private sphere of the household, this could explain why problem solving in the moral sphere is different if males and females perceive their social roles in terms of this public-private distinction. As a matter of fact, females in a test done by Lawrence Kohlberg suggests that females resolve moral dilemmas by an appeal to the relationship the behavior has in the personal realm, to the personal realm. So in trying to resolve a dilemma, they might look first at the impact of the solution on the personal realm rather than the public realm, in which case it explains why males, including adolescent males, perceive their future role in the public realm and so resolve current moral dilemmas in terms of an appeal to universal principles or universal rights. So logic can provide criteria for evaluating causal hypotheses based on logical criteria. The first criteria I want to examine and discuss is the criteria of whether the hypothesis being proposed is compatible with existing knowledge. Now, obviously, this is a conservative criterion, given that it looks to the present as well as the past. Our body of knowledge at the present would be the relevant application to applying this criteria. Now, the history of scientific revolutions, according to Thomas Kuhn, documents a change in scientific paradigms as a result of the current paradigm producing anomalies that aren't explainable within that model. Therefore, the model of quantum physics has replaced the model of mechanical physics, given its superior capacity to explain subatomic particles. So compatibility with existing knowledge is limited to the extent that current knowledge may be eventually replaced by more adequate theories. But it's a good logical starting place when evaluating the validity of competing theories or hypotheses should entail a reference to what we know at the time. So in evaluating a hypothesis based on its compatibility with existing knowledge, you need to evaluate the validity of the causal relationship, F1 being the cause and F2 the effect. A discussion of the existence of F1 isn't sufficient as a basis for evaluating the hypothesis unless F1 doesn't exist. If there are no discernible differences in male-female brain activity, then it can't be the cause of our differences with regard to moral problem solving. But just because F1 exists, it doesn't entail that it's the cause. So today I'm going to take an effect, F2, as school shootings in the US, and I'm going to look at 4 different causes, 4 different F1s. Okay, the first one I want to evaluate in terms of compatibility with existing knowledge is the explanation of mass school shootings is due to excessive playing of violent video games. So just providing evidence that there is a rise in the playing of these games doesn't prove that it's the primary cause of school shootings. But if there's no video game playing in a society, it can't be the cause of mass school shootings. The other hypotheses we're going to evaluate today based on 4 different logical criteria are bullying as a cause of these shootings, poor parenting, and finally, mental illness. Let's evaluate these 4 hypotheses with regard to their compatibility with existing knowledge. The first hypothesis. Violent video games can affect different children differently. For some, it may provide a strong stimulus for engaging in the violent activity in the game. And this may influence their behavior in more aggressive forms in the real world. But most kids can tell the difference between real and virtual violence and understand how bad it would be to seriously harm a real person and will not be motivated to do so. In fact, it may provide a type of vicarious satisfaction that results in a lesser motivation to engage in real violence. Second hypothesis. Bullying can result in a bullied child's pent-up rage over being hurt and humiliated. More likely, the bullied child will seek the advice and help of parents and teachers in order to end the bullying. The pent-up rage is more likely to be used against the bullier and not random kids and teachers from the school. Poor parenting, hypothesis number 3, often leads to kids acting out to get attention, including in the forms of violent behavior. It can also be the cause of a child's poor social training in terms of anger management. It can also be the reason why parents are unaware of the child's anger and his stashing of guns. But the social norms against bullying innocent people and harming innocent people can outweigh the limitations of poor parenting. Other sources of norms against killing exist: teachers, adult relatives, church members, movies, and books. Hypothesis number 4, mental illness. The fact that a student engages in mass killings of innocent kids and teachers suggests the existence of a serious mental condition. Sociopathy, narcissism, psychosis, and paranoia. And these conditions militate against rational behavior and rational motivations. So, from the viewpoint of compatibility, logic suggests prefer the hypothesis that's compatible, most compatible with existing knowledge. Criterion number 2, testability. From a logical perspective, a hypothesis that can be verified or falsified suggests that it's preferable to one that can't. Let's look at some metaphysical hypotheses. The devil made him do it. Or there's an invincible aura causing irrational behavior. They have a vibe that operates in a universe of human motivation. These can't be tested because they're invisible, mysterious forces. Testing our 4 hypotheses requires that if one uses the method of difference, which I will be using in this discussion, the 2 groups that are being tested must be similar with regard to certain variables that may themselves be the real causes. So the test must keep these variables constant, otherwise they can limit the validity of the test. For example, in applying the method of difference to the hypotheses, you would divide the groups into 2 subgroups, one containing F1, the apparent cause, and one not containing F1, the apparent cause. So for the population of F1 violent video game players, you want to separate a population into violent video game players and no violent video game players. But the communities without the video games and the families who prohibit them may be themselves contributing to the fact that the kids don't act aggressively. So given that there might be other relevant factors that could be linked to actual violent actions, the 2 groups should not include families or households where a kid was bullied, families or households that have poor parenting or have a history of criminal behavior or a history of mental illness, because the presence of these factors will throw off the validity of the results. The 2 groups should be as similar as possible in order to validly test the violent video game hypothesis. So the 2 groups of families with children with respect to the issue of video games should have parents of similar backgrounds, similar socioeconomic status, criminal history, level of education, geographic location, religious status. It's not a good test if you compare a non-Mormon community with a Mormon community that prohibits video games as the not F1 community. Okay, so what about the bullying hypothesis? You would want to compare a school with a high level of bullying to a school with almost none and keep constant the socioeconomic status of parents, religious affiliations, criminal history, and education of the families that have kids in that school. For the 3rd hypothesis, poor parenting, you need to divide the population with poor parenting and the population with good parenting based on objective criteria. Your test should not involve asking kids Did you have good parents or poor parents? So we're looking at objective criteria by which to subdivide the large group into two smaller groups. The one with the H1, F1, and the one without F1. Okay, so how would you divide families into two groups based on objective criteria? Well, here are some suggestions. Parents who don't go to school conferences, parents that don't go to their kids' events, parents that don't help get the kids' homework done, parents that don't respond to the kids' bad behavior, parents that don't share any family time together. All those would be criteria by which the two groups of parents, poor parents and good parenting, could be divided, and still keep constant the variables we talked about that could upset the validity of the results. Okay, mental illness can be the basis for determining why school shootings occur. And the two groups, kids without mental illness and kids with mental illness, can be divided into two groups based on objective criteria, such as suspension, expulsion for violence, institutionalization, and the involvement of mental health professionals in the child's life. And then the variables that should be kept constant are the ones mentioned already. The third criterion for evaluating a causal hypothesis is the criterion of explanatory power. Some logic books call this the criterion of predictability. I prefer to call it explanatory power. This is the capacity of a hypothesis or a theory to explain phenomena other than the phenomena that's being explained. Here, mass school shootings. A good example of a hypothesis or theory with an enormous amount of explanatory power, the ability to explain different and unrelated phenomena, is the theory of relativity as proposed by Einstein. This theory has been applied to issues in geometry, interplanetary events and activity, and molecular physics, and the list goes on. The more different types of facts a hypothesis can explain, the better it is, according to logic. So the question here would be, how many different, possibly unrelated facts besides school shootings can the hypothesis also explain? Again, you want to look at the hypothesis as F1 causes F2. So you want to look at that relationship between the cause and the effect, not just the existence of the cause. Okay, so the playing of violent video games has led to less TV watching, but that's not a phenomenon much like school shootings. We want to look at how the playing of violent video games can change the brain and a child's motivation in a negative way, in actions of cruelty to others or self-destruction, which is also the outcome of school shootings. So, the explanatory power of the first hypothesis, the playing of violent video games, explains certain negative results for some kids, the withdrawal from social interaction, and a lessening of empathy. Recent research has revealed that as individuals gain more power, they lose in terms of their sense of empathy. So a child's perceived increase in power in a virtual reality game would suggest it might affect their capacity for empathy. What other facts besides school shootings can the bullying hypothesis explain? Well, it explains the rise of suicides in Japan from being bullied. Japan is an honor society, and it explains suicide as a result of bullying because of the status of the social status of the child that's been bullied. It can also explain the rise of virtual violent activities among kids that have been bullied, or the joining of violent organizations such as the neo-Nazis. What negative consequences can the poor parenting as a cause of school shootings explain? Well, it could explain the continuation of gang activity in the US. It could also explain children and adolescents sexting. What else can mental illness explain besides school shooting? Well, it can explain the increasing social isolation of young people, and it can explain cruel online behavior and virtual stalking. The last criterion I want to discuss is the criterion of simplicity. There has been debate in logical circles about whether simplicity or complexity is a basis for positively evaluating a hypothesis. But either way, applying the criterion of simplicity will be looking at the same types of facts. Okay, here's an example of a phenomenon that violates the simplicity assumption. It's the chariot of the gods hypothesis that was cited as the explanation for how it was possible to have the pyramids built by the Incas or the pyramids of Egypt, the any kind of mass building, architectural or natural, Stonehenge in England, that would require sophisticated mathematical knowledge and a huge number of personnel to accomplish it. So this hypothesis suggested it was extraterrestrial aliens that came to planet Earth in order to complete the pyramids and other large human projects with limited knowledge and personnel. What assumptions have to be true if that hypothesis is to be believed? Well, let's look first at the positive assumptions, the facts that must be true if the chariot of the gods hypothesis is true. And the more facts that must be assumed to be true makes for a less simple hypothesis, especially if the assumptions are implausible. These might be the assumptions of the chariot of the gods hypothesis, the positive ones. Conscious life forms can be sustained on other planets. The awareness of these life forms, of the events occurring on planet Earth, the willingness of this population in the past to help us with our problems, environmental problems, but they're not helping us at the present. For example, we haven't figured out how to store our nuclear waste. Where are the extraterrestrial aliens when we need them now? Okay, and of course, the fact that they failed to communicate with us since their previous visits. The negative assumptions would be all the alternative explanations that are being denied. For example, that there was insufficient knowledge and insufficient personnel. Let's look at the positive and negative assumptions of the violent video game hypothesis. First, kids can't tell the difference between virtual and real violence. Secondly, these games change the kids' brains and motivation in a negative way rather than providing vicarious enjoyment and precluding real violence in the future. And just as importantly, social norms, significant adults' morals, can't outweigh the negative impact of the game. The negative assumptions, it's not mental illness, poor parenting, bullying, a decrease in empathy among young people. These will be the similar assumptions for the negative assumptions for the other three hypotheses. Okay, what about the second one, the bullying hypothesis? It assumes that parents and schools are ineffective in helping children deal with bullying, and that the object of rage of the bullied child is acting out against innocence. And it would have similar negative assumptions. It's not mental illness, poor parenting, etc. The poor parenting hypothesis assumes that no other significant adults have influenced the child, and that School shooters act out to get the parents' attention, and they don't care or realize that it may cost them their own lives. The mental illness hypothesis seems the simplest, that kids can be so ill that they carry out school shootings, but that they haven't been given adequate counseling or adequate medications to control their behavior, or that their mental illness has gone unnoticed. So either their mental illness has been unnoticed or psychological intervention has been very poor. So, in conclusion, I would argue that a modest knowledge of school shootings can still enable a person to deal sufficiently with evaluating the hypothesis that our society has proposed for an explanation of this behavior.